Hi, I'm Dr. James Miller. Welcome to the Philosophy of Religion. In this course, we'll explore issues surrounding the nature of world religions, arguments for and against the existence of God, the implication of religion for ethics and science, and some approaches for experiencing the mystery of the divine. You may come to the subject of religion from your own religious viewpoint, or you may approach the topic as a skeptic. Regardless, the philosophical exploration of religion will challenge us to hone our skills of inquiry and analysis, while hopefully opening up a sense of curiosity and wonder to the human inclination to seek a creator or a transcendent experience of the supernatural. Explore the topic to deepen your faith or to test your doubt. Either one is a great place to start. So welcome to the Philosophy of Religion. Let's set out to see if we can answer the question of why we ought to study critical reasoning if we operate from a perspective of faith or a religious perspective. If we already believe in God, what do we need to study critical reasoning for? Well, let me tell you about an incident that happened to me. There was a day a while back where a couple of young men with bicycles and neckties showed up on my front doorstep. They rang the doorbell and they said that they wanted to talk to me about the Book of Mormon. I asked them, have you all read the statement that the Smithsonian Institute has released about the Mormon history of America and how there's absolutely no evidence to justify the Mormon history of the warfare that allegedly happened in the United States, in America? And one of these young men on my doorstep replied to me, well, that's really between you and God. The problem is, it's not between me and God. It's between me and the Smithsonian Institute. Or actually, it's between them and the Smithsonian Institute. Because when the plain evidence suggests that something that you have believed on faith is wrong, you have to deal with the evidence there. To simply dismiss it leaves you in sort of a blind system of belief that has no grounding anywhere. And then we can simply ask the question, well, why choose that one? Why choose Mormonism instead of Islam or instead of Orthodox Christianity or atheism? If you're just going to blindly commit yourself to one faith or another, how would you pick? At some point, critical reasoning has to be a part of the process, and critical reasoning can both enrich our faith life while protecting us from things like cults and bad ideas and fallacies and deceptions. Critical reasoning allows us to think through what we've said we believe with a skeptical eye, but also to build edifices of belief based on what we find to be true. So I want to talk for a little bit about how faith and reason relate. Traditionally, there's been a view or a suspicion on the part of a lot of the public that faith and reason are at odds with one another. The formal name for this philosophical school of thought is fideism. Comes from a Latin term for faith. Fideism is the belief that reason and faith really don't have much to do with each other. Faith can exist on its own without reason. It's an internal conviction either of God or the Holy Spirit, or just an inspiration that can't be subject to critical review. Some fideists will even hold that faith and reason are at odds with each other, and you sort of have to pick one or the other. This is a view that's become fairly popular in recent thinking in the Western world about faith, particularly from people who have not studied it very much, but there's a long history to it. If you go back to the early church fathers, there was a church father named Tertullian. Tertullian lived at the end of the 2nd century, and like many early church fathers, he sought to defend the Christian faith. But in a world filled with Greek philosophical ideas, he took a particular vantage point from the side of faith. Tertullian wrote in his prescription against the heretics, he said, what indeed does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What does Athens, that capital of Greek thought, of philosophical thought, have to do with Jerusalem, the holy city, the city of faith? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? In other words, the matters of faith are completely removed from the matters of philosophy. Tertullian would take that view, though many early church fathers would disagree with him, most importantly, Augustine of Hippo, who would say that in fact there's a synthesis to be drawn between the truths of Greek philosophy and the truths of revealed faith in the scriptures. Tertullian was an early proponent of a kind of fideism, but he certainly wasn't alone. Martin Luther, the great reformer of the 16th century, would lead quite a revolution against the Catholic Church and would form what ultimately became the Protestant churches. He at one point says that reason is the greatest enemy of faith. And by that he means faith is something that God has revealed by appearing on the earth. For reason alone to conceive of God becoming human or a God dying and rising again, Luther would say that's absolute nonsense. Reason cannot establish truths like that. So faith is therefore divorced from or wholly separate from reason. Luther would then go on to use a bunch of argumentation on the basis of reason for the positions that he holds to, showing that he did not give up reason wholesale. I don't think there's any way that one could. But perhaps the primary philosopher that people go back to when they try to look for a divide between faith and reason is Soren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher from the early 19th century. Kierkegaard lived in a season of acculturated Christianity in Northern Europe, where everyone claimed to be a Christian and everyone claimed to belong to a church, whether or not any of their belief was actually sincere. And Kierkegaard was most put off by the insincerity of a socialized faith that involved no real commitment to Jesus or to the doctrines of the Christian faith. So Kierkegaard is trying to aggravate, to provoke a settled Christianized culture and encourage them to look at what they actually believe. Kierkegaard would tell a story about a clown that sees a fire that's coming. The local circus has come to town and set up outside of town, and the circus has caught fire. The clown comes running into the town to warn the townspeople there's a fire coming. It's in the middle of the night, and they all open their windows and see the clown bouncing around outside, and they begin to laugh at him, and they don't take his threat of the fire seriously because, after all, he's only a clown. Well, that's sort of how Kierkegaard saw himself, as warning the European public we're ignoring the real call of faith, its passions and warnings, and we've settled into an acculturated Christianity that's insincere. Kierkegaard would say that between historical knowledge, the belief that there is a God that lived in Nazareth, and faith that actually passionately puts one's weight down on that knowledge, actually trust in that God, he says those are a world apart. And there actually at some point has to be a leap from one to the other, a leap from knowing that God is real to living like God is real. Kierkegaard is attributed with having called that a leap of faith, but in fact he never uses the term leap of faith. He does talk about a leap from that kind of historical knowledge to an actual passionate, wholehearted commitment to belief in God. So that's a rough introduction to fideism. Fideism is that belief that faith and reason don't need each other. Faith especially does not need reason. And in fact, they may be in conflict with each other. Reason may lead one away from faith. And so for the fideist, reason is to be discarded and faith is to be trusted. Well, there are all kinds of problems with that kind of thinking. Again, once one pushes reason by the wayside, how does one make decisions? Every process by which we come to a decision was in one way or another rational if it wasn't completely haphazard. And in general, haphazard decisions are not decisions that we respect. We respect well-reasoned decisions. So it seems hard to say that we can come to some area or subject and simply put reason by the wayside. The arguments in favor of putting reason by the wayside are themselves based on some kind of reason. Now there's another approach to the relationship between faith and reason, and it is sometimes called rationalist religion. Rationalist religion, or rationalism in the area of religion, began early on in the Christian story among the early church fathers who sought to defend the Christian faith in a world where they were a minority voice and lots of people wanted to argue against them. The Roman Empire didn't like them and began persecuting them around 65 AD when Emperor Nero blamed them for the fire at Rome. It's said that Nero lit Christians on fire at night to keep his garden lit. Throughout the first 3 centuries of the church, there was persecution of Christians on and off in the Roman Empire. And so more educated Christians went about the business of trying to defend Christianity rationally in writing to other intellectuals to say that Christians should be respected and allowed to exist peacefully. One of the early church fathers, Justin Martyr, wrote a defense of the Christian faith against the Roman apologists of the day who argued against it. Justin Martyr would answer charges or accusations that Christians were atheists because they didn't worship the Roman gods, and thus that they were disloyal to the empire. Martyr would use a sophisticated philosophical reasoning to say, no, we are not the threat to the empire that you presume us to be. And in fact, Christianity should not be seen as a threat to the empire, but rather a wholesome and well-reasoned approach to life. Justin Martyr was one among many of the early church apologists who would try to make a rational case for Christianity. To do so, Justin Martyr would appeal to a Greek philosophical idea that the Greek philosophers already held to and say, look, that jibes with something that is true in Christianity as well. And the concept is called the logos. The logos, from which we get the English word logic, was said to be the foundational ground beneath all thinking, the thing that gave the world order and sense and structure. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus would write about the logos as being that which undergirded everything. And so when the gospel writer John went to write his story of the life of Jesus, he begins by saying, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. John takes this philosophical concept that the Greek philosophers were already using and says, hey, you know that idea of a logical foundation for everything, the thing that gives reason and meaning to everything? I know who that is. That logos was born in human form as Jesus of Nazareth. So let me talk to you, Greek philosophers, about the logos that you already believe in. Justin Martyr would do exactly the same thing. Pick up the idea of the logos and say, you and I are on the same page. We just know who the logos is. The logos has revealed itself. Later on in the Middle Ages, other Christian philosophers and theologians would use rationalist religion, a rationalist approach to religion, to defend the Christian faith. One important one in the 11th century was Anselm. And Anselm wrote a book called the Monologion, in which he says, if anyone does not know, either because he has not heard or because he does not believe, that there is one nature, supreme among all existing things, who alone is self-sufficient in his eternal happiness, who through his omnipotent goodness grants and brings it about that all other things exist or have any sort of well-being, and a great many other things that we must believe about God or his creation. I think he could at least convince himself of most of these things by reason alone, if he is even moderately intelligent. Anselm means to pick up on that line from the Psalms that says, the fool says in his heart there is no God. And Anselm wants to say any reasonably intelligent person could convince himself that there is a God out there, that the world needs an explanation, that it's hard to account for creation and life and reason and morality if there is no God behind it. Anselm was one of those philosophers who took reason and said, rather than seeing it as opposed to faith, I'll bet we can use reason to argue our way into some level of faith. The Apostle Paul will even say something similar to this in the beginning of Romans. He'll say that God's invisible qualities, his nature and his power, are known through what has been made, so that we're without excuse for not believing. That's where Anselm picks up. He begins by saying, let me argue the case for God using reason alone. An even more sophisticated version of that would come from Thomas Aquinas a couple centuries later. Aquinas would argue that there were 5 solid proofs for the existence of God that any reasonable person would have to commit to. Aquinas's writing is abstruse. It's thick and hard to get through. It's a kind of metaphysics that most of us are not used to reading today. But Aquinas constructs 5 arguments for the existence of God that he believes would lead any reasonable person from a position of doubt to a position of belief. Maybe not belief in Jesus specifically, but a belief in a creator God that is over all things. In the modern day, there is another thread of rationalist religious apologetics that is popular today, and perhaps the ultimate kingpin of this circle of thinkers is William Lane Craig, a currently living philosophy professor who has 2 PhDs and has spent a good part of his career traveling around the world and debating anyone who will take him on. Atheists, scientists, skeptics, anyone who wants to debate, is there a God or not? And is the case for Christianity solid or not? Craig has done some brilliant philosophical writing in this field, and one of the best books on the subject is Reasonable Faith. Anybody who's a thoughtful reader who wants to really take on the question of whether or not God exists might want to go ahead and read the book Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. My own book, Hardwired, is another book in the thread of rationalist apologetics. It says that there's a case for God that we should be able to see by reason alone. But there's another thread of rationalist religion that's existed in philosophical circles that has sort of led in other directions. An example of that would be the writings of René Descartes, a French philosopher who lived in the 17th century and basically who ushered in what we now call the Enlightenment. Descartes famously tried to doubt everything, his experience, his knowledge, his senses, and what he was left with was that he was still sitting there doubting things. So doubting existed. Doubting was unquestionable. Doubting went on. From that, Descartes makes his famous assertion, "I think, therefore I am. My thinking is the ground for my existence." Descartes then does sort of a fanciful theological two-step in which he argues from his knowledge of his own thought world to the belief that there are clear and distinct ideas in his mind that cannot be doubted and that therefore must be true. And most importantly among those beliefs is a belief in God. Now, very few philosophers or theologians would follow Descartes on this argument. It's not a very good argument. But it is a school of thought in the world of theology and philosophy that reason can be used to argue towards the existence of God. However, this kind of rationalist theology often led to a kind of belief that was very different than Christianity. It led to something called deism, which is the belief that there is a God that might have started the world up long, long ago, but that God does not get involved in the affairs of this world. He is not transcendent. He does not interrupt. He doesn't answer prayers or work miracles. It ends up with something very different than Christian religion generally. It's a kind of proof for the existence of a God of the philosophers that's very different than the God of the Christian faith. All that to say, in contrast to fideism, there's a thread of rationalist religion that runs throughout history. Some have believed that faith doesn't need reason and in fact is threatened by reason, and others have said, no, actually reason leads to faith and should be used to defend the faith. The people who believe are going to, at one level or another, incorporate reason into their thinking and their approach to life, and faithful people ought to embrace that. Use that to ask questions about God, pursue questions about God, and defend the faith that they've chosen to commit to. Now, in all that, I want to go back to the teachings of Jesus himself and ask what Jesus would have said about fideism and rationalist religion. And I want to read to you a passage from the Gospel of John, chapter 20. And this is an encounter that Jesus has with his disciple Thomas after Jesus has risen from the dead. Remember, Jesus traveled around with his 12 disciples and many others for about 3 years. And then he was crucified and died. He was buried, and then he rose from the dead. And he began to appear to people who were shocked at his return. This is what happened with Thomas. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20 at verse 24. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, which means the twin, he has a twin brother or sister out there somewhere, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So Jesus appears to them, but Thomas isn't around. So the other disciples told Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Jesus was stabbed in the side with a spear when he was on the cross, and Thomas says, "Unless I feel that, I don't believe he's back." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So here's Jesus' approach to the subject. When Thomas is a skeptic, which Thomas kind of was, when Thomas has to see with his own eyes and touch with his own hands because he's a tactile learner and he won't believe it on the witness of other people, Jesus doesn't scold him. He doesn't ignore him. He doesn't send him off to eternal hellfire. Jesus appears to Thomas and says, "Let me satisfy that curiosity even in the midst of your doubting, so that you may believe." We who have serious questions about faith and life should be comforted by this passage. It tells us that Jesus isn't eager to punish us or to scold us or to send us away when we have doubts and questions. Instead, he welcomes them. Jesus likes it when people think for themselves and ask good questions about him. Jesus acknowledges that there will be those who live blessed lives because they don't have to see it. They'll just come to faith easier and their hearts will be more satisfied more quickly. But that's not to shun Thomas. Thomas, and people like him, are still welcomed in the company of Jesus. And so, as we talk about critical thinking, as we talk about the relationship between faith and reason, realize Jesus is no enemy of reason. Faith is no enemy of reason. Instead, reason can be used to support the Christian faith and to advocate for the Christian faith. But I'd say, along with a great church father of the Middle Ages, ours is a faith-seeking understanding. This is how Anselm put it. Ours is a faith that seeks to know more, to pursue God with curiosity and intellectual humility, wanting to know more about God and about the world. We believe, but we're willing to review our beliefs because we want to know whether or not they're well-grounded. I, for one, will happily chuck any beliefs that I held on to when I find out that they're not true, because why would I commit myself to something that's not true? But if the Christian faith is true, then it will stand the test of reason. It'll just be all the more convincing when we see that reason confirms what the Christian faith has always taught. I hope that's helpful. God bless you in your studies.